This is Matthew here, and tonight, or should I say this morning, I'm going to do my best to tackle a subject that I wouldn't say is like necessarily controversial among Christians, but it is definitely a little bit, I would say, of a cause for friction with like younger Christians and like newer Christians, that have, recently, just started learning about Christianity in general, believing in God, live by his virtues, that and the like. It's very, I feel like it's very tricky, to actually talk about old fashioned values and the like. Um, with the younger generation, both like men and women, just because it's one of those things, especially once you say like the word submission, especially within marriage. It's very much so that like there's this weird stigma of like, oh, like you can't use that word, like that's it's not it's very much like not a politically correct sort of statement to make in this day and age, which is sad, because that is not what it in fact means. With the whole notion of oh, putting women down and whatnot. It's more so in line of like, hey, look, like fundamentally speaking, the husband is at the top of the pyramid, right below God. Right? It says God, husband, and then below him is wife. You know, and all the children. It's not that like, oh, in terms of importance, the wife is any less important than the husband. It's just fundamentally speaking, God put man as the head of the household and women in charge of the household. You know, and I would say that alone, I'm going to try to focus on a small amount of things tonight, just because it can and will most likely get a little convoluted. Mostly because I'm just tired and I'm doing this probably with a little bit less sleep than I should. But um, I digress. So yeah, it's very tricky to talk about in general these days because of the fact that yeah, there is a really weird stigma of if you're being a submissive wife, you have no say, in the relationship. You have no free will. But realistically, fundamentally, and just spiritually speaking, it first, it's, very much so, the leadership, it carries the leadership aspect of the relationship. You need to, the man, the husband, is supposed to, lead you, teach you stuff, and that's the thing that I feel has a really bad stigma today. Is guys telling their wives or their girls like, hey, like we need to do this, we can't do this, like I don't want you doing this. And I mean, I get it, I get it, like it's not great to be kind of just told that like, hey, I can't do this, but um like if your man, or your husband, especially if your husband is telling you like, hey, I'm not comfortable with it, and he gives a very much so logical, and well informed, or just in general, just hey, like this is not good, I see like this is going on, like this person is bad influence, like that sort of thing, like that on a base level is seen as like, oh no, I'm not going to do it because no, like I don't feel like doing it, like he's not, I have my buddies, but like that's not the point. It's the fact that like he's seeing, that hey, this person is not, going to have a good impact on your life. This person is telling you to go party or do drugs. And if your husband is like pointing that out, like I'm just saying, like in the first place, you definitely should not be, you know, on a base level, calling yourself a Christian and like doing drugs or like, but I'm just saying, like, if you're theoretically in this, situation, there's that word's gonna be thrown around a lot, just because I don't want to like upset anyone per se, but I also am gonna speak the truth. So yeah, it's definitely one of those things which is a bit touchy, you know. because a lot of women these days, obviously, are taught to be extremely independent, which I get, 100%. Especially with everything going on, with like all the work stuff, how hard work is these days. I get it. It's rough. But when you're in a relationship and you're preparing to get married as a woman, you know, it's I would say, like, and probably I know for sure, you know, people, like, my inner circle, for example, um, which is obviously guys, it very much has that same concern, in varying, levels and facets, right? Like angles, POVs, um, of like, hey, like, am I gonna end up with a girl, that's gonna become, my future wife? Of like, hey, if I ask her to do something that I'm not comfortable with, and it's completely like a legitimate concern of like, hey, like, I don't want you talking to this guy because, this, and she doesn't do it, because she's like, oh no, I want to stay in contact with him, too bad, but it's just very troubling, I would say, very much so, because, and I hear this a lot. I hear this a lot where it's like, oh well, it doesn't matter if you're my husband, I'm still gonna do it. I'm just saying that is so fundamentally a red flag of like, hey, like, especially specifically, I'm gonna keep saying this, specifically if it's a completely logical, virtuous, and where you obviously have the moral and ethical high ground. Like, I'm just saying, and it goes both ways. Like, look, if your wife is saying like, hey, I don't want you looking at this, don't do it. Especially if it's like, very much so like going to lead you down a dark path, or like whatever the whatever the thing is, basically. But especially in, my experience, so far, and I'm not going to go into like details, but I'm just going to go into generalization, um where it's like, look, like, fun, like, the way it should honestly work, between two people that are in a relationship that are going to be, married in whatever amount of time, especially when you're serious, with that person, is you do need to start practicing, submission to a moderate degree. I'm just saying, because obviously, you're not married yet. You're not one flesh together, but you do need to prepare. Both people need to prepare. Like, I need to prepare to be a good husband, to be a good father. Especially, the father was way down the line because of financials, right? But, still, the point sense, I need to get ready, and like, I need to prepare myself to like take a stand. Like, hey, like, if my wife is, going to do something that's fundamentally like lacking in ethics, or lacking in morals, or lacking in just common sense fundamentals, for being a Christian, I need to call her out on that and like teach her, gently but firmly, and she needs to comply. Like, she needs to, I say comply, but like, it's just, I say comply because of the fact that, like, in this day and age, with like how society raises women and conditions them to be independent to the point of like there is no difference between how they treat their man, their husband, their husband to be, and whatnot. They treat them exactly the same as when they were dating. So, like, for me, I see, I'm saying it, one, because there should fundamentally be a difference between, how, not how much you listen, but like in terms of, I would say, the level of like submission does need to be completed, by the time you do get married. That's my understanding of it, in terms of like, because there should very much 100%, not a debate, there should be a difference between like, you as, courting, your girl, and you guys are in, complete understanding with each other, and you guys have a disagreement, about this or this, obviously you can still disagree, but like I said, especially when it comes to like acquiescing, like being like, okay, okay, I'll go through with this. Like there needs to be a fundamental difference in terms of like the independent. I don't want to say like independence or like the conformity of your wife. Listening to what you have to say. Um, I'm not saying like, oh, they are going to be brainless and they have to do whatever you tell them. I'm not saying that. Like, I'm saying if like let's say for example, let's just use the age old concern, which is completely realistic, of like the whole, the debate of like, can men and women, be buddies, especially, if you're married. Like, what do you think of like a guy being, a BFF of your girl? So I'm gonna be honest, my view on it, and mind you, I'm just saying, like, I know there might be a disagreement here, somewhere, um, but I just don't. I'm not okay. Like, if I feel threatened, like, if I feel like he is endangering the integrity of our relationship, I'm not okay with that. Like, I'm okay with, you know, my girl, my wife to be like having, you know, like a BFF guy, but it's very, with caveats. Like I'm not gonna allow them, you know, like you shouldn't allow, both in both sides of that. Like you shouldn't be, and you should be putting in yourself, or like, as the woman, as the wife, or like as the fiance, as the girl. Um, you shouldn't be putting yourself in situations which can possibly lead into, something you're going to regret. I've always stood by that, whether it's like, you know, I think that's also why I'm just not really a big fan of like really crazy, bridesmaids, because it's fundamentally not like there's no ethical and there's no moralistic backing of having like one, like a, like the quote unquote, one last, go crazy night, in terms of, bridesmaid. um and it's definitely something I am concerned about. Um because I would definitely would say, in terms of, for me, I am very much an old school, um very much down to earth, but I would say definitely a little stricter when it comes to how I view, morals and ethics in relationships. Um, and it's not like so much I'm not willing whatsoever to meet in the middle ground, of it, but it's just hard to. It's hard to like meet, like it's hard to meet in the middle, and there to be like acquiescence between both, you know, the man and the woman in general. I would say these days, just because it's just so much like a power struggle. And I'm not saying, like, again, I'm not saying like, oh, I don't want my girl, I don't want my wife to have no free will. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying, especially like if it's something that is in any shape or form can be like duplicitous to the relationship, I am like not okay with that, you know? And sad to say, I will say this, that it is very tricky at times to like verbalize and like use the correct vernacular when explaining this in general with your girl, right? Because in general, I would say, like, especially if like you're more so of like kind of like the very much old school, the very much like not like disciplined Christian, but like very much so like stalwart, and like, hey, like this is what the Bible says about, submission. This is what the Bible says about, like, women need to follow their husbands. Obviously, I feel like there is always the caveat that there is, obviously, if your husband is doing, some messed up stuff, some freaking, like he's cheating on you, like obviously, no, like you should not be following that man. But if the man is constantly giving you virtuous advice, calling you out on stuff that like needs to be changed, and like I will always so sorry, like look, at the end of the day, you and your wife, you and your fiance, you and your wife slash husband to be should be iron sharpening iron. It's not like it shouldn't be some sort of like debate every single time, like especially when it's like 100% like one person has the ethical high ground. Like it should not be some sort of like crazy apocalyptic debate. I just find that a little ridiculous. I'm actually big time ridiculous. Because of the fact that it's like, look, like I get that you disagree, but this is wrong. Like this is morally or this is like ethically wrong, and it is definitely frustrating when like in this day and age, where you see couples fight over like stuff of like the guy doesn't want his girl to go alone with her with her guy BFF, and her responding really negatively and aggressively negatively towards her man, and society says that's okay, but biblically, and just in general in terms of proper etiquette, like no, like you there's like in terms of like the whole guy, the whole girl trip, I'm more okay with that, as long with the caveat, as long as I know, those girls that my girl is going with, that my wife is going with and whatnot, is a good influence on her and I can trust, right? Same thing goes with the whole, thing, but especially with the caveat of like, look, like fundamentally speaking, morally speaking, you should not be alone, in a potentially um in any sort of setting where something can happen that you're gonna regret. And it's definitely like with me, like I said, like it's definitely in line with like the whole infidelity, cheating. Like I am very strict on that. Like I have no sort of oh, that's okay because of this. Like fundamentally speaking, like some situations can be, I would say, understandable with other people, fair enough. But for me personally, and as with other Christians, 100% as a Christian, you should like not be okay whatsoever with infidelity. Like, with your girl, with your man, because like that, and I'm just saying, but if either side is, giving each other flack for being concerned and taking steps, to it's steps and like, giving instruction of like, hey, like I don't want you going with this guy alone in a cabin. And if your woman or your man, if he's going like with his coworker or his quote unquote, that's a red flag. I'm gonna be honest. Like I know that may be very much a hot take these days, but I'm sorry. Like you should not like, especially with the whole, like I would say it's similar to like with kids with autism. I 100%, to give an example of like how it 100% should be as a Christian. Like look, like you should not be alone with a man or a woman, you know, that isn't your husband or your wife. That's just common sense. Like that is a fundamental pillar, one of the fundamental, pillars of, you know, leading a virtuous, life with your husband or your wife. It's one of the fundamentals, one of the common sense things that you shouldn't have any sort of trouble accepting. If like for example, like my girl does have, a guy BFF, using it as an example, in terms of like, because I'm not saying like it's one of those situations where like different, like because there are Christians 100% that are even more strict about this than I am and that don't tolerate it whatsoever. I'm using this as an example. So for me, like I'm very much on the more lenient side. Like I don't necessarily mind my girl having, a guy BFF. I really don't, but if she does give me pushback on, like, if she's gonna be alone with him, I'm not okay with that. Like, I'm not okay with that. Like, I trust her, but it's one of those things where she shouldn't be putting herself in that situation to begin with. And I know that's a bit of a hot take these days, but I very much have always, believed, and it is very much a moral high ground slash ethical debate, type type point where it's like, should you or should you not put yourself in a situation where you can fall, to temptation for, like, cheating, especially when it comes to cheating or infidelity or doing something you're gonna regret with someone that's not your man or your woman or your husband or your wife. And I'm saying this across the board. I'm not just saying this for women. I'm saying this across the board. Like, guys have been, in the recent generations, have been screwing this over royally, and it's been damaging to the role of men as a leader, as the one alpha, you know, because at the end of the day, and I know this may be another hard take with some people, but God didn't say that there's going to be two alphas, in a marriage, right? There's one alpha. You can see it in animals. There's an alpha wolf, like the male. And like I said, it's not of like, oh, you have to like bend the knee. I think I think that's a little bit too much of an extreme example per se. In terms of you know the act of like bending the knee, like some sort of medieval thing. Um, but I digress. At the end of the day, like, fundamentally speaking, submission very much should 100% be based on fundamental common sense attributes and morals and ethical stand bullet points, I guess you could say, or core um, values that are biblically based, especially within um, a relationship, and also very much so a marriage, and I'm just gonna tell this, because I'm working my way through it myself, is like, look, you gotta start, from, like, once you do see some stuff that's concerning, um, with the relationship, in terms of like, hey, like, is your woman gonna follow your lead and gonna acquiesce when you're calling out things that is like legitimately concerning, because if she constantly fights you on that, if she constantly is very much so like being like, no, I want to do this, but like I know it's not like morally or ethically right, but I'm still going to do it anyways, even though you're telling me not to do it. Like, that is a red flag, you know. And your woman should 100% acquiesce when it is something like, obviously, very much so, like, ethically questionable. And I'm saying this in not only as a guy, but as also as a Christian, and also just common sense. Like, if you're put into a situation as a guy, as a man or as a woman, especially when you're in a relationship, and also as a husband or a wife, you shouldn't be putting yourself in a situation where you may fall to temptation. Not saying you are, but it's one of those things where you shouldn't be doing that in the first place. So I know my take is pretty strict on it, and is definitely a bit, a little bit heavy. But I 100% can tell you, like, I have seen, and talked with, I think, like, one of my inner circle, Victor, um, is very much more strict on the submission part than I am. Like, I feel like there is very much, obviously, you do need submission, from your woman or your wife. But it's very much more like, I very much focus more so on the ethical part, or like the moralistic, or like just in general, like, hey, like, if I'm feeling uncomfortable because you're doing something that's putting you in a situation that um can lead to something bad, like, that is 100% realistic and understandable concern to have, and you should not have a problem doing that for either your husband or your wife. Like, that I would say that's something that goes both ways. So, um yeah, I very much have a more light-handed approach to it, but I will say I do tighten the leash in terms of, well, not tighten the leash, it's a horrible analogy, but tighten the reins of, like on your chest or whatever like that. I'm having a terrible time coming up with a description with this, but like, you know what I mean. Like, look, like if something is, objectively setting off red flags on your conscience as a Christian regarding your man or your woman, you have a fundamental, obligation to call them out on what they're doing. Like if like for example, like if my girl said like, "Hey, I don't want you talking to like Stacy because she seems like she's hitting on you a bit." 100%, I'm not going to be talking to Stacy now. If the same thing is happening with my girl, I'm gonna ask her the same exact thing. Like, hey, like I don't feel comfortable with you talking to James. Um, Obviously, I think there has to be a legitimately moralistic concern or ethical concern that of something that's being breached or broken, especially in regards to relationships slash marriage. And while I would say there is a difference between the scaling, I guess you could say, of submission um, before marriage and when you're married, um, I think that's very much more so stringent, than not stringent. So I know that's definitely a bit controversial these days. I mean, it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be controversial, but it is. Um, but it's definitely something I worry about, to be honest, as a future, husband and father, and it's definitely something I want and need to pass down to my kids. Um, for me, I'm more so like, hey, like I'll talk to our sons about it. I'll tell them about this. I'll sit them down. We'll have a father son lunch and we'll discuss it. We'll do some fun stuff. But we're gonna be going over this. Um, and I very much expect the same thing of I want my wife to go over this stuff with our kids and be like, hey, this like, especially once they start getting near of age, 16, 17, like I want them to know like, hey, this is okay, this is not okay, you know. And I think it is important, you know, these days to stand by your ethics, by your morals, because it doesn't get any easier, guys. Especially when you get older. You want to just acquiesce yourself and like not debate or argue. But a lot of times, and 100% of the time, you do need to, because you need to make sure that person knows, like, hey, this is not fundamentally okay to be doing. This is going to damage our relationship. This is going to damage our marriage. Um, and it's important that women do see like, hey, like, is my man doing this because he's concerned, or is he doing this in terms of like confining me? And I will say in my experience, I've seen more so than not it is like a legitimate concern, and it's disregarded by the wife. I'm not saying that's how it is every time, but I feel like, especially with my generation, there is very much the startings of like the belief of like, hey, like you can say no to your husband if you want to, even if it's like a moralistic concern, And I think that needs to change in society these days, for husbands to be solid, father figures, and showing and leading by example. Because if he's constantly being second guessed by his wife, like that is not a good example for the children. That's not a good example as they grow older, like that. It's not okay. So I think it's definitely something that every Christian man and woman should pray about, and it's definitely something where if you're having a lot of doubts about it, and or you're feeling like, oh, like this is like destroys rights. Like I'm just saying, like if you think that it like destroys like women's rights, I'm gonna be honest, you need to check yourself because it's not about like, oh, like men having control over women. It's like stuff that's like honestly very much understandable that God knew was going to be a little bit of an issue. Where like, men, women putting themselves in a position, of like, oh, I could do this in this location, you know, because I said no to my husband even though he knew I was going to be doing this and it was wrong. Like, it opens a whole other can of worms of like, hey, like, why did you marry this person? Because, even if you knew, because you, like, why did you marry this person if you knew they weren't going to follow your lead, you know? And I think that's definitely something that shouldn't be joked about these days. I think it's a very active issue, and it 100% is an issue, you know. Um, but I hope this helps, people out. I'm still, praying about this. I'm still looking up biblical, doctrine on it, because it is, it can be at times a bit tricky to really explain this in the current day, where it's not like, oh, it's destroying women's rights. It's not. It's not. It's one of those things where like, look, if you can like if you can like sit next to God, right? Like, like basically the whole, what would Jesus do, right? If you can apply that to, you know, an iffy situation, you need to start praying and you need to like really be like, okay, how in the world did I get to the point where I think this is okay? And from the other POV, it's like, hey, like if your husband or your wife, because I think 100% both or answerable to God and very much to each other. To be like, hey, like I told you, I did not want you to go to this ethically, morally iffy place, but you did it anyways. Without my blessing. Is that okay, or is that not okay? And honestly, it's one of those things where like, even if you know a lot of times, even if you point that out and be like, hey, like, look, God said this and this about this, a lot of times, men and women who say they're Christian, husbands and their wives that say they're Christians, men and women that are courting each other, that are in a serious relationship, working on marriage, that are thinking about it, they do tend to unfortunately be like, oh, well, that's okay, I don't want to fight about it, so I don't want to argue, so I'm just gonna let it be. You have every responsibility as a Christian to be like, hey, this is wrong. I'm allowing my husband or my wife to like go off and do this. And it's one of the things where like common sense was you shouldn't be doing that in the first place. You know, like your conscience, I guarantee you, your conscience is going off if you're doing something like that. But it's one of those things where God gave us free will. God gave us the Holy Spirit, which fuels our conscience, because God definitely gave us, the conscience as a built-in moralistic compass, which a lot of people tend to just ignore. But it's there for a reason. God provided that to us from the get-go. So, yeah, food for thought. But wow, it's 30 plus minutes. So hope you guys I wouldn't say like enjoy, because this is very much understandably a more heavy, this is more understandably heavy subject matter. But I will say, I'm praying for anyone who is possibly dealing with this or just wants information, for this for the future, because it's definitely an intensive type of subject matter, you know. Um, but yeah, this is Matthew here, logging out, and I will see you guys in the next Deep Talk podcast.